All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. Welcome to this webinar, Conceptualizing Education for Sustainable Development, Framing the Work of the TESF Network Plus. My name is Tara Sprague. I'm a research associate with TESF based at the University of Bristol. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. Just to let you know, we're recording today's session and we will be putting it on our website. So please, if you can help us by minimizing sound, by muting your microphones, keeping them mute until we get into our breakout rooms later on, and by keeping your video off as well, that will help us out. So today is the first in a series of seminars that TESF will be having to introduce you to some of the background papers that we have been working on. And we're hosted today by both the School of Education at the University of Bristol and the Research Center for Comparative and International Research and Education. So we want to thank our hosts very much for having us today, and a special thank you to Christy Smith at University Bristol, Research Administrator, for all the work that she's done in helping organize today's webinar. We also want to say a special hello to a number of our leadership team, our advisory group members and core staff who are here, and you'll get a chance to meet a number of them when we get into the breakout rooms. So, as we said, this is a very open conversation today. This is the beginning of a journey, and we are opening this background paper up for discussion, and we're really glad that you're here to help us answer some key questions. I'm just going to move us on to the next slide. Oops, sorry. There we are. Okay, so the objectives for today's session are to get some feedback. After introducing to you TESF, we're going to show you a brief video that will explain what it is that we're doing, who we are, where we work, and how we do our work. And you'll be provided with some links to that video to watch again later. And then after this video, we want to get some feedback on these two main questions. So Raphael, can you provide some links in the chat for us with this introductory video so that folks can watch it again on our YouTube channel, and to this foundations paper, which has recently been put on our website. This is the basis of today's consultation. So the order for today is, after the video, we're going to have a series of presentations. Poonam Batra is here with us from University of Delhi and the head of our India hub. She's going to be discussing with us what is the problem that we're trying to address in TESF. And then it will be over to Leon Tickley from University of Bristol, who is our primary investigator. It's going to be discussing two aspects. What do we mean by sustainable development? And what do we mean by education for sustainable development? And then it will be over to Professor Hela Lot-Sisitka from Rhodes University, who is the lead of our South Africa hub. And she'll be talking to us about what do we mean by transforming education systems. We'll then have some feedback from Professor Eric Herring from University of Bristol, who is one of our co-investigators, to raise a few questions for us and give us some initial feedback. And then we'll be breaking out into breakout rooms. If you haven't ever done breakout rooms in Zoom before, don't worry, you'll be automatically prompted to just accept your breakout room. You'll go into a room of around 10 people, and then we will provide the link. In fact, Raphael, if you could provide the link for the Padlet, we'll repost this link when we do breakout, but there's a Padlet, which is an online interactive board that has two questions already waiting for you. And if each group can put their reflections and questions and ideas on there, then we will come back together and receive some reflections from Professor Carrie Facer, who is another of our co-investigators, and she will be pulling together some of the things from the Padlet before we then open up and use the balance of the time for Q&A, and we'll close at 1:30.
So I'm just going to briefly talk about this very complex problem that we're trying to address. And I think the two slides may not do justice to the complexity of it, but it's important to flag some issues. First of all, Do we not need to sort of look at education itself and the role it may have played in actually a development that's been unsustainable? So before addressing the question of how we look at education for sustainable development, we probably have to unpackage some of the role it has played in making societies unsustainable. So which means that education will need to be located in the larger frame of coloniality, modernity, the socioeconomic context, economic and development policy. And I think the role of modernity becomes critical because that has shaped education since colonial times in the countries that we're working in. And our education remains sort of trapped in the colonial frame, so to speak. While technology heightened modernity, it also sort of challenged us because societies that were basically inequitous, and we struggled with social and gender disparities while modernity was sort of really pacing high. So the 19th century knowledge, view of knowledge that we had, which was really individual, scientific, universal, all of that was fairly disconnected with the social and the cultural. And it led us to a space where we were really looking at knowledges as decontextualized and abstract. So the conflict between the indigenous and the Western, and which means culture and education, the conflict between that was successfully avoided because we looked at a universal outlook. But in this frame, environment itself was also not seen as tied to people, their cultural practices, and natural phenomena. The second important issue is with regard to quality education, especially as we come into the contemporary, within which quality education is being defined in very narrow instrumentalist terms, and which means it's really a set of disconnected learning outcomes, perhaps even irrelevant, and with a greater sort of focus on high stakes testing. And curricula is more and more being homogenized, which means it's failing to address the local concerns, the languages, the local languages, and knowledges. And therefore, narrowing curriculum in this manner actually also means that we do not look at how development and education are related. And also, we do not look at development as a people-centered idea. Within this frame, then, we have what is called the learning crisis. Now, learning crisis, the way it's sort of popularly understood, is very instrumentalist as well, because the focus is on numeracy, on literacy, and I think we need to sort of look at how this concept of quality education and the learning crisis has severed learning from the pedagogic processes and from teacher professional judgment. So the role of the teacher seems to be getting more and more marginalized. I'll need to look at the second slide. What I find is that given this instrumentalist nature of looking at quality education and at the learning crisis, we are missing out on some very critical aspects, which is the social emotional health of children, for example, or we look not even looking at affective goals, which are important for a holistic development. And this discourse on the learning crisis also does not acknowledge the effects that different inequalities have, for example, caste in the case of India, race, ethnicity, class, gender, or even disability. So in the context of disadvantaged learners, we are not looking at this as informing us to understand what learning crisis is about. And within this frame, teachers are actually reduced to teaching very lower order cognitive thinking themselves and teaching that to children, which means minimalizing the very aims of education. And teachers have sort of lost their agency. They've been undermined as epistemic identities, and the discourses of teachers, which means teacher knowledge about children, about learning, about knowledge in general, which is subject, pedagogic, that has remained unchanged because of the colonial trappings and the neoliberal sort of frame, not allowing teachers to exercise agency. And I think in conclusion, I'd like to say that the current policy trajectories, which are very heavily influenced by an international policy epistemic community, it's tending to minimize the idea of education itself to mere learning. And it holds individual children and their backgrounds as responsible for learning rather than systemic inequalities. And lastly, that these also indicate that reforms which favor private enterprises are important, and legitimizing the role of non-state actors, which is actually taking us quite far away from addressing the significant aspects of educational inequalities in addressing issues of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poonam. I didn't even have to hear the wind chimes. That was very time efficient. Thank you. We're going to pass over to Leon, please, to go through 2 topics with us. So.
Sure. Okay. So in my part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on what we mean by education for sustainable development. And of course, you know, what we mean by education for sustainable development is very much linked to our underlying view of what we understand by sustainable development itself. And in both cases, both with respect to sustainable development and education for sustainable development, they can be seen really as floating signifiers. You know, they mean all things to all people. But in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, they can also be seen as metafixes, as ways of bringing together diverse interests and concerns around sustainable development and education for sustainable development. So I want to talk to you about some of the main discourses that are shaping the SDGs. And when thinking about the SDGs, I think as a group, we like to keep a critical distance from them. We refer to them really as a work in process. We understand their importance in terms of mobilizing concern around sustainable development around the world and galvanizing action in governments and so on. But we also treat them critically for some of the reasons that I'll allude to in a moment. So I think, you know, a key discourse that's reflected in the SDGs is this idea of inclusive growth, and it's an example of a growth-led model. And of course, you know, these go right back to the dawn of the development era. The modernization theory, for example, which sought to cast development in terms of a Western view of modernity, was an early example. The idea of inclusive growth, we feel, is innately contradictory in the sense that, you know, growth has also had the effect of causing environmental catastrophe. So we have really taken inspiration from other kinds of ideas that seek to link the economy and education. And Tara, I don't know if you can just flip very quickly to the next slide and then back again. So this is one of the alternative models that has inspired our own thinking in terms of the relationship between education and the economic domain. It's from Kate Raworth's work, and she really, rather than talk about unlimited economic growth, she talks about operating within planetary boundaries, the importance of regenerative and redistributive economies that meet basic needs and also do not exploit and spoil the environment. Please go back, Tara, to the previous slide. So all of these ideas you can explore in much more depth in our background paper. A second discourse really that's been very influential in shaping ideas about sustainable development are rights-based discourses. And whereas, and in education terms, those have been reflected in movements such as Education for All and the idea of lifelong learning. And these have also been, of course, incredibly influential. We think, again, you know, they kind of coincide with lots of the ideas that we have about education for sustainable development as a group starting out on our journey. But we also recognize that they can be problematic too, in the sense that sometimes, you know, they can appear quite top down as a one size fits all kind of set of prescriptions. So we are also attracted to the idea of the capability approach, or some of the ideas within the capability approach. And I think what they try to do is they try to relate education not to an idea of economic growth, like human capital theory does, for example, and other growth-led models, but actually to a view of human well-being and of natural flourishing. So we think it's quite useful to begin to take account of the role of education in supporting more holistic outcomes rather than just scores in cognitive tests, which tend to be what growth-led models tend to prioritize. Rather looking at the role of education, more holistic development, not just in human flourishing, but in supporting the capabilities or the opportunity freedoms of natural systems as well. And that, of course, has major implications for education. We're also informed by environmental approaches, which, unlike the first two discourses, have tended to be more critical of some of the ideas implicit in some of the SDG agenda. For example, the growth-led models. So, you know, ideas like degrowth or no growth have been put forward by people working within a more environmentally oriented approach. And of course, you know, in education, the role of environmental education, as well as more recent initiatives like eco-villages and eco-schools, have been important for showing human beings in inseparability from the natural environment, and the absolute importance for us developing in harmony with natural systems. But of course, you know, as us living in the West, you know, we have perhaps, whilst we've been transfixed by modern notions of growth, of course, you know, other cultures and civilizations going right back through time have had very different relationships with the natural world. There's a big emphasis at the moment on decolonization, and that's reflected in South Africa in the Roads Must Fall movement, but also in other initiatives around the world that have sought, for example, to decolonize the curriculum. And these kinds of perspectives we think are important because they show the value of challenging the normative epistemic basis of the curriculum and much discourse about sustainable development, and seeking to bring Western understandings into much closer conversation with the indigenous and local knowledges in different parts of the world that have for many centuries put forward alternative ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And all of these concerns really are taken up to some extent in this idea of sustainable futures. And this is really something that we're very interested in as a group. UNESCO has got its Future of Education's initiative that builds on a long history of UNESCO's leadership in this area. But essentially, this approach is really about our role collectively in determining our futures. And by nature, it seeks to decolonize and to be inclusive. It seeks to really take on board some of the environmental challenges and to respect the capabilities of human beings and of natural systems. But also it asks us to trouble at quite a fundamental level the basic mindset that with which we use to anticipate the future, whether that's in terms of our conception of the individual as just economic agents, or whether it's our conception of worldviews, which tend to be very much linked to modernist agendas, at least in the West. So I hope that gives you an idea of some of the kind of perspectives that we've been looking at. Tara, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just finish by just pointing to our definitions. And you can see that some of these concerns and ideas are reflected in our working definitions. So like all of our thinking, this is all work in progress. We we really value the opportunity today and going forward of being in conversation with you and the wider community that's interested in these topics and issues. The idea of being able to fund lots of Southern-based research, Southern-led research, is very exciting. We recognize that our understandings must also fit with the realities on the ground and take account of Indigenous understandings of these issues too. But so these are just up for offer. They're a starter, if you like, of a conversation and a journey. You can see that we define sustainable development in terms of development that supports the rights, freedoms, capabilities of existing and future generations to live the lives they have reason to value, whilst protecting and co-evolving in a more harmonious relationship with the natural environment. And of course, we see human beings as being integral to that. The role of education is really to support and facilitate that process. So going back to Poonam's earlier presentation, it's about redefining what we understand by a good quality education, away from very narrow instrumental gains in cognitive achievement to a more expansive view of how education can support sustainable futures. I'll stop there and hand over to Hala, who's going to talk a little bit about the idea of transformation, which of course is another idea that's core to our work.
Thank you, Leon. I'm going to just try and share screen quickly. I'll just open on my side here. Let me just. Yes, so I think this is such an interesting project that we are part of here, because it's really one which really tries to take the full scope and develop a deep and wide understanding of what it means to transform education systems for sustainable futures. So it's an ambitious project, but it's also one that I think there's so much that seems to be coalescing in this direction, and I wanted to open up a little bit with that particular point. I like the little logo of this project because it's got this sort of very energetic kind of movement to it, and I think that this is really what's going on actually as we look into the emerging scholarship possibilities in education. Is this sort of energetic movement, but what actually is inside of the energetic movement, and where does that energetic movement emerge, is I think some of the things that we can talk about in transforming education systems. Now I just have to get my screen so that I can move everything. So what's been very interesting to observe in the last while, and it's a bigger question actually, and it's one in which education sits, and that is that for a long time we've had a lot of work and discourse about sustainability. We've had sustainable development, we've had the emergence of the SDGs, we've had various world summits. In fact, some of these world summits have been some of the largest gatherings of world leaders around any particular critical issues through history. And so there's kind of like been a long and interesting emerging concern about the state of the planet. But what's been so interesting for me in the last as little as 3 to 4 years is that suddenly there's a big attention to the social sciences in trying to come to understand what to do and how to respond, because the earlier work was very much more economically orientated and also science orientated. And now we're seeing a move where there's a very big interest in the social research, social sciences, and the educational sciences. So I have this little logo here, which is Transformations to Sustainability, which is an International Social Science Council call that went out a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. And it was the first major international call for research that focused on the social. And inside that, there were a number of projects that were supported. One was on environmental justice. The other one was on T-learning, which is learning processes, and the other one was on pathways to sustainability, policy pathways. And when we try to look at that in terms of education, you can see that this project that we're working on now is probably one of the largest funded education for sustainable research developed projects that we've had so far globally. So it's a very significant and important project that we need to take seriously in our entire community. And as that project is unfolding, there's also this massive movement going on in the policy sphere around rethinking education, and it's a very interesting process that's occurring there, because it's a very broadly consultative process. So it's not just the policymakers that are trying to rethink education, they're trying to do it with society and with researchers and with communities. So this research project is very importantly placed, I think, to really take up this opportunity that we're looking at here in terms of trying to understand educational transformation and the system transformation that Leon was talking about, and that he gave us, both him and Poonam gave us that fantastic background. So I just wanted to look at it a little bit here as a sort of, in our paper, we talk about complex systems and, you know, what is necessary to look at in this sort of transformative process. And of course, Leon's given us some of that, and so has Poonam. But I wanted us to think a little bit about how do we make sense of complex systems? And of course, there are many ways of doing that. One of the tools that we do have is Pascal gives us this idea of a dialectically laminated and complex constellation. So we see that transforming education system is a multi-leveled activity, and it's also constellationally related. So what happens to a child in a classroom, as we've seen with the COVID-19, has got so much to do with what's going on in global change processes. So there's a constellational relationship between what's going on in global change and with the experience of children in classrooms, for example, or people in communities, persons in communities and places. What goes on with pedagogy, we've seen that as well. The COVID-19 has just like shot that particular issue right up into the, you know, into all of our, in front of our eyes so kind of clearly. And of course, there are these different things that go on at different levels in an education system. So there's curriculum, there's programs, there's qualifications, there's whole institutions and whole institution change, there's pedagogical change, there's change in relationships between what we found in our COVID-19 research in the SADC. One of the most important things we need is a relational change between schools and parents, and that parents and school governing bodies and communities can be able to work more closely together to cushion the kinds of challenges and shocks that have just been experienced. So we can see that system transformation involves work at all of these levels, you know, transforming the philosophies, the histories of education, the politics of education, the purpose of education, and then ultimately this process of transforming our being as we are as human beings living on this planet in a very rapidly transforming and highly unequal and very rapidly warming world. So the challenges are huge, and it's, I think, no surprise that we now seeing so much more emphasis on social and the need to think about education, but think about education transformation much more deeply. And the one thing that we learn about complexity theory, from complexity theory, is that there's systems of emergence and relations of emergence, and they operate all over and across a system that looks a little bit neat. It's of course never quite that neat. And I really struggle. So you can see that these sort of relations of emergence are quite kind of complex, and they're connected, interconnected. And so when we do research on transforming education systems, we need to hold this kind of a multi-leveledness, as well as the kind of complex relationality, as well as the systems of emergence in place, and the non-linearity that I try to just show with that little picture there. Then the other challenge that we have, and I'll touch on these last little bits more quickly, is that we're trying to do this work at a time where the tools that we have been produced for us in another time. So they're not adequate actually for the times that we're in. So our concepts of learning, for example, our concepts of education system change, they come from another time, the time before. They don't come for now. So we have to produce new concepts, we have to produce new ways of thinking, and we have to be very careful not to get stuck into these sort of the cultural histories that hold us back. So this is challenging. It's very challenging for researchers because we like always to reference what came before. Of course, that's important, but we also have to be brave enough to produce the new and not just get stuck in referencing what came before. So we have a number of our PhDs on the platform today, and we've just had some brilliant seminars this morning where the PhDs are just taking up this challenge, you know, of producing what we need for now and into the future, and not getting too stuck with what was there before, but at the same time doing this very careful review of what the challenges are and really unpacking them properly. So this is part of the work that we're going to do and are doing in this project already. We're also sitting with this challenge, which Leon also touched on, is that we're sitting with a highly unequal planet. We're sitting with huge histories of exclusion. Poonam mentioned those. And then we're sitting with, you know, inadequate logics. So Poonam mentioned that we're trying to produce the learning crisis as the problem of the child, but it's not the problem of the child. It's actually the problem of these systems, and they're deep and they're unequal. And so we have to give much more attention to epistemologies of the South. We've got to look at, you know, you can see this picture here is really the picture of research output. So all of our educational knowledge that we're actually trying to work with in research is really produced mainly in the global north, and we have to produce a different voice coming through. So we need a wider view of education systems. You'll see us talking about that in the paper, where we say we're not only talking about schools and classrooms, we're talking about communities, community learning, social learning. We're talking about learning between schools, communities, and policymakers and others. So we really need to reimagine the platform that we're talking about when we talk about education systems. And we also need to think very carefully about what this is about. It's about transformations to sustainability, but it's actually about socially just transformations to sustainability. And that's a huge area of work as well that still needs to be done. It's completely inadequate at the moment. So there's a lot of work to do, including in the area of learning theory, education system theory change, and so on. So, and of course, there is a lot of this work that is being done, and we need to also, you know, connect with it and build it outwards. Just this system. And one of the areas that we need to work on is our research. So we need to transform our systems of research. And this is just a little picture coming from our research context of, you know, where our researchers have actually, in educational researchers, they've been moving out of the classrooms and into multi-actor learning networks, which include people who work and learn in classrooms, but also people who are farming and doing other things in society. So, and then to work with people to co-define their matters of concern, to identify the absences that are holding transformation back, and then trying to resolve these together. And this is a multi-leveled practice. It's not a practice that occurs just at a kind of what you would call a local level. It needs to happen at policy levels. It needs to happen at all levels in our societies. So if I can just move the next slide on here, then I'll be finished. So what we also then need to do is think very, very differently about educational research. We need to think about different units of analysis. We need to think about multi-layered system research. This is a beautiful unit of analysis picture from Annalisa Sanino. And we're working up the 4th generation of cultural historical activity theory, which works across these multi-level systems around common objects of transformation. And you can see there sort of these are the sort of zones of proximal development that these groups establish for themselves in collective formations. And those are 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional, you know. So the type of research that we're looking at is we actually need, you know, T-learning in our research designs and in our thinking about research. So that's just a tiny touch actually on the transformation space. It's an absolutely huge space. It's such a creative space, and it's just super exciting to be doing this kind of work together with the platform that we have. So I think just, you know, this is just a little kind of summary really of the massive transformations that we're looking at. And of course, it's an open and dialectical kind of space, you know, from working with the limitations of existing concepts to producing new counter-hegemonic concepts, from working with a primarily individualized education system to one that's really orientated more towards collectivity and common good, and so on. You know, I won't spend a lot of time on that. But yeah, and that's really the project, is to do that kind of work together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hela. Thank you. Also check out the T-Learning website. Is fantastic, folks. If you can find that, that's a great source of inspiration, that project website. Let's see, Hela, if you can unshare, fantastic. Thank you so much. We have Eric Herring with us, who's now going to give us some thoughts to launch us into our breakout rooms in a moment. So Eric, are you here? Just, if you can turn your video on, Eric. I'm prompting to unmute as well.
I'm not allowed to do it. You have to do it.
So we can hear you now?
I'm not allowed to turn my video on. You have to turn it on for me. Okay, great. Are we going? I can't, I've lost track. Am I visible? Oh yes, hi. Sorry for that, a little glitch. I won't detain you long because I think it's incredibly important, these things that we draw on the huge expertise that we have in the people who are involved, attending this webinar. So I just want to offer a few words of reflection and question to link into the discussion. One of the things that has really interested me about this project is that although we have come from UK, Netherlands, India, Rwanda, South Africa, Somalia, Somaliland, it's been really incredibly interesting that we find ourselves having our initial workshop where we really agreed on the fundamentals, and that was very heartening. That it's not enough to just have more education. It's not enough to just have better education, more of the same, but it needs to be fundamentally different, so that we are educating for sustainable development rather than for unsustainable development. Second thing that really struck me was our understanding that these issues are global. It's not about how do people in lower income countries match up to what the people in the higher income countries are achieving, but actually this is a fundamental problem that we are all facing. So transforming education for sustainable futures means here in Bristol as much as it does people in Kigali or whichever other place. So that's the first thing of great interest. Second is the importance of context, that even though we agree on a lot of general principles, it's really striking that we're having to reinterpret to a really large degree in individual context. And we actually have mechanisms for that in this project. The key feature is the plus funding with very large sums of money that will be used to co-produce projects with local practitioners and researchers in various places around the world, so that we're actually building those projects from those places and building them up together, rather than us deciding in advance what that agenda will be. And we're developing that agenda over the coming months, that will then develop into many projects. I think it's going to work at about 80 projects around the world, and it's going to have over £2 million across all those projects. So it's really significant funding to enable us to produce many projects. So it's a very exciting way of going about things. I suppose the last thing I want to say is that we really want your input. You know, the presentations you've heard today are very much first words rather than last words. We're going to be taking notes from what you have to say in the discussions, and we're going to feed those ideas directly into our work. So please do understand that by participating in these sessions, you're actively shaping the project. We're really setting this up so that we can then listen to you. It's not just us here to tell you what we're doing and what we've achieved. I just want to leave with a question to pick up on, which is, how do you relate general principles in different contexts? How do you navigate the space between those two things? How do you ensure that you still have your general principle and that you still take into account that particular context? So that's the question I want to leave everyone with. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. All right, that's a lot for us to consider, and already you're putting your thoughts on the Padlet, so thank you very much for already beginning that process. We're going to now begin to initiate the breakout groups. You'll be prompted to go to a breakout room, and if you can please have someone or someones in each of the groups adding to that Padlet. We're going to be keeping an eye on that, and then come back together, and Carrie Facer is going to pull together some of the strands from what you're sharing there, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So thanks very much. Raphael has put the link to the Padlet in the chat. So Christy, if you can send us off on our bit. Amazing, Carrie, you've got a hard job. I don't know how, were you actually in a breakout room?
Yeah, I'm also in a breakout room, so this is going to be interesting.
Double job. I think we'll just wait. Christy, will you let us know when it looks like almost everybody's back in?
Sure.
And thank you for putting the recording back on.
It's all right, Carrie. I should have told. Maybe I should have messaged you to say you could actually leave at any time if you'd wanted to.
I didn't want to leave. I was having a nice.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Let me know when you want me to kick off. Tara, with some
I think almost everybody's back in now. Welcome back to the main room, everybody. Thank you for adding so much thoughtful content to the Padlet and for having conversations in your breakout rooms. Now that you're back in the main room, if you've got your video on, if we can encourage you to shut your video off. Carrie's now going to take some minutes and pull together some of the threads from what is there, and then we may have time to take a question or two from the group. Thank you very much, Carrie.
Okay, so I hope I will leave time for questions from the group. In terms of the Padlet, I won't just read everything, but I think one of the really interesting questions that came up for me actually in our conversation as much as anything else was a conversation about how we anchor big ideas of the future to place and to individuals, and how we create an understanding of the relationship between kind of big abstract ideas like sustainability and the sorts of futures we might be worried about and we might be concerned about. Oh, and Hala said the same things come up. And how does that anchor in kind of lives and places and personal narratives and personal stories? The second thing that came up was the question of emotion, and thinking about things like hope and fear. And actually, now I think about it, it feels to me that that's a gap in what we've been talking about, is really thinking about how we deal with education as an emotional practice as well as an intellectual practice. And then another topic that seems to be coming up is also, we're talking about sustainability, but how do we conceive of the natural environment, also perhaps as teacher and as collaborator and as learner and as participant in this. So I think there's a really useful challenge to us to say, how do we make that visible, more visible in the work that we're doing? What would it mean to be part of this conversation, for example, and to think about how we bring the natural environment into this sort of practice? And here's some of the things I've been interested in are some of the things that are happening around, for example, earth rights movements, and also learning from indigenous practices and rituals. So I think that might be quite an interesting set of questions for us. And then finally, I think we've got this really hard question for, you know, this transformation is radical. It has so many different responses. It has so many different sites of action. Poonam, you talked about the wider battles for equality, the role of teacher agency. Leon, you talked about the role of discourses and new economic theory. Haley, you talked about complex systems, multi-level systems, relational change. And Eric, you were talking about co-production. And I think one of the really interesting things that I take away from this conversation today is how can we begin to sort of visualize and grasp the multidimensional nature of the challenges that we're facing in ways that don't overface us, but that give us sites for action that help us to identify levers for change. And one of the questions on the Padlet was interesting is, what are the tools of analysis that we might use? So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. I'll leave it there because I'm sure there are other people that have questions or comments they might want to add from the groups.
Thank you very much. If you can, those who want, we've got, yes, just try of 10 minutes left. And if we can encourage you, because doing this, waving your physical hand, I won't be able to see you, but if you can use the raise hand function on the Zoom, then someone put their hand up. We'll use that to raise your hand. Oh, I see, so we got some people also doing thumbs up, so I'll try to keep an eye out for that as well. So Theodorio, if you can, I'm gonna unmute you. Got a question, your hand was up first, please.
Yeah, Tara, thank you, Tara. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. You have a question?
Yeah, not really a question, but I just want to say that the focus of this research is something that is similar to what I'm doing with my PhD research now, learning inequalities and resources constrained schools. And in fact, when I read the background, your message sent to me, I felt, wow, it's like an angel was sent to me. And all through today, I've learned good things about learning inequalities and education and how to really go about it. And I'm hoping and believing that partaking in this research process give me more insight into the inequalities and how to manage it. Thank you. Thank you. I want to say thank you to the organizers. You've done a good job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. All right. And, sorry. Just scanning to see. So we've got David with a question. Should be prompting you to unmute. We should be allowing you. We can't hear you yet, David. Anyone else, please go ahead and use the raise hand function. That's different than the reactions function. I can't see those, but oh, sorry. So David, you're unmuted now. Did you have a question?
No, it's not a question, but it is appreciation that I've been working in the historical issues. This project TESF is covering a wide range of issues that we really face. For example, in Tanzania, I'm working on language of instruction, the L2, but also I'm working on how to decolonize the curriculum. That was very, very, very important aspect that has made me really see this test very interesting. but also I like the idea of that education is being, the idea of education was narrowed and was termed just as learning, mere learning. You know, it is really, when you get into the deep and to the context of the disadvantaged school communities that I'm working in, you realize that we really needed this. So anyway, I don't know for how long will TESF last, but I think really with the huge and enormous things that I'm seeing it is going to bring in education, I'm very convinced that, and I pray that I look this happening, and I'm ready to support it also as a partner of it. Thank you so much, Tara.
Thank you for that supportive comment. And I think there was a question in there. I don't know how long it's going to last. And if that was in reference to the project itself, it's a 3.5-year project, but with an intended legacy beyond that. And so you can find out more details about that kind of logistical aspect on the website, tsf.network. So thank you, David. Is there anyone else that would like to say a quick question or comment, and then I'll hand over to Leon just to have a concluding word before we wrap up in a couple of minutes. All right. Thank you. We've got last comment or question from, is it Essie? Let me just unmute you. Ooh, 1 minute. It's still prompting you to unmute. It should. Aha, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this meeting. I just wanted to ask if there was a way, aside the social media aspects, whether there was a way to stay connected with what is happening, and also if something is coming up in our own personal research, whether there was anything we could contribute to what you're doing, with how we would do that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a really important question, and Raphael's just put a link to the website itself, which is going to be the way to stay informed as we go along. So we'll be developing the call for proposals, which will go out in December. And that's one way that you can get directly involved if you're involved in work in the 4 hub countries. That is one direct way in. And of course, we'll be having more of these seminars, which is a way to help us to, beyond the activities of the hubs, get a wider view of your perspectives and integrating that into our findings and our outputs as we go along these 3 and a bit years. So I'm going to, with just 2 minutes left, thank you for that question, hand back over to Leon Tickley just to make some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thanks Tara for chairing the meeting. Thanks to everybody who's contributed, and to especially all the participants who've joined us. Your ideas are like gold dust. They'll really help us to refine and develop our thinking. It's a work in progress, and we're glad that you've been part of it. There's a question from Joan de Jager in the chat, hearing a need for the project to identify ideas, examples of positive change and hope, and think about how they are communicated to educators, policymakers, and larger groups. And I think that's really what we're about. We want to not just critique, but actually make a difference in the world. And I think what these plus-funded projects allow us to do is to really develop, some Southern-led research and perspectives, pick up on what's positive and is working out there as well, and learn how to communicate that from people who are doing this kind of work already. There's a lot of good work out there already that we should build on. So as Tara mentioned, the call for proposals is due out in December. If you're working in a space of positive change, of hope, or if you have an idea of innovation, of change, if there's research you'd like to do that can help us to better understand the relationship between education, sustainable livelihoods, sustainable cities, and climate action, which are our 3 areas of focus, we'd really welcome your ideas, your proposals when that call is released. So do keep an eye out on it on the website. We're not being idle in the meantime. We've been held up a little bit by COVID, but of course we're seeing it as an opportunity because our partners who are conducting research that we think will help us to better understand how education systems can respond to crises like the COVID crisis in a way that will make them more sustainable and contribute to sustainable futures. So, so we're blessed to have wonderful partners, wonderful hub leads in each of the countries, really strong teams. And whether it's in Somalia or India, in South Africa or Rwanda, there's really important work to be done. The challenges are all slightly different. And as Eric, going back to Eric's point, you know, we want to be able to draw on what is relevant, what is contextually relevant. So I'll stop there really, just to once again thank you all very much for being part of this conversation today. To our presenters, to Poonam and to Hala, to Tara for chairing, to Kerry and Eric for responding, and for all of your wonderful questions and contributions. Thank you.